It was 1968, the peak of the swinging 60s, and we were living in London. The place to be. Carnaby Street, Portobello Road Market, the King's Road, mini-skirts, colourful uniforms and Afghan coats. However, there was plenty of time for these in term time, and this was summer. We had travelled in Europe and the Middle East. This time we had decided to hitchhike to Morocco. Why was there a 1960s urge to travel to far-off places? For a start, as a generation we were not saddled with debt. Education was free. I had completed a student apprenticeship at the Royal Radar Establishment, at the time the largest electronics research place in the country. It was a golden age, no fees, free books, and a small wage which easily paid for accommodation, with something left over to run a motorbike or an old car. There were even 3 free rail passes a year to visit parents, and jobs were easy to find. For some it was the influence of Zen Buddhism, spread by such books as Jack Kerouac's The Dharma Bums, or transcendental meditation, as popularized by the Beatles and the Maharishi. The political situation was such that hitchhiking, or travelling in an old vehicle to India, was possible and cheap. For me, the main influence was Jack Kerouac's first book, On the Road, which had become a Bible of the Beat generation. As a teenager, the nearest I came to the Beats was with the Beatniks, who congregated on a wide wall near the slipway in St Ives. The council took a dim view of them and came up with a novel solution. They removed the wall and replaced it with a railing. It reached the national press, and there was even a postcard to commemorate the authorities' heavy-handed victory. At college, several of the students used to hitchhike home at the weekend, but for me hitchhiking became an obsession. I did hitch to London to visit jazz clubs. You could spend Saturday night in Ken Collier's and hitch back on Sunday, or down to Cornwall to see my parents, but mostly it was just for the experience. I discovered that I could reach Scotland or the East Coast and back in a weekend. However, I did have other influences. My paternal grandfather took the True Adventure magazine Wide World and saved me copies. There was also Ben Carlin's book, Half Safe. This describes his intrepid journey around the world in an amphibious jeep. Another book was the autobiography of a supertramp. This describes W. H. Davies' travels in England, America and Canada. Kerouac travelled overland, backwards and forwards across America. But we could travel overland freely in Europe, the Middle East and beyond. And once you left Europe, it was incredibly cheap. It was important that wherever possible one travelled overland. Where was the romance in popping up somewhere by plane? Without the hardship of land travel, it would be like going to the cinema. We preferred to travel by Happenstance, where each stage of a journey depended on what next presented itself. The modern trend of only being able to travel cheaply by booking in advance destroys the serendipity and romance of chance. Our first plan was to make a quick start by train and ferry to Paris, before hitchhiking south. However, by chance we discovered a cheap rail ticket, which allowed unlimited journeys on French railways, provided one spent a defined time in France. It seemed too good an offer to miss. In the 1930s, the wealthy could travel to Paris via the London, Newhaven, Dieppe, Rouen route. In 1968, this route was still possible, and it appealed to us. On the 5th of July we set off, and the ferry docked in Dieppe late evening. There were very few foot passengers, and by the time we walked to the passport office, it was just closing. It was pouring with rain, and Dieppe was not at its best. We decided to take refuge in the station. But to our surprise, it was closed and locked up. Wandering around the outside, we found a small door. I tried the handle. It was unlocked. We crept in. If there'd been anyone around, our trail of wet footprints would have betrayed our irregular entry. However, the station was silent and creepy. We found a sort of waiting room, which for some reason was still lit. There were some wooden benches, and we slept rather fitfully until about 3 a.m. The station then gradually came to life. A train for Paris arrived. We got in and tried to get some more sleep, but it was too cold. The departure was for 4 a.m. There were very few passengers, but at least the heating came on, and we were then able to sleep all the way to Paris, Gare Saint-Lazare. This old postcard gives a good view of the station. Our London-issued unlimited travel tickets were examined, but accepted without problems. Enquiries informed us that there was a train for Hendaye on the Spanish border, leaving at 9:30 p.m. from the Austerlitz station. This was in the right direction, so the next part of our route was determined. It was 6:30 a.m., so we were free to wander Paris for the day. Unfortunately, it was still raining on and off, but we sat and ate bread, pâté and tomatoes in one of our favourite places, the small park behind Notre Dame. It seemed like a good day for bus rides. In those days it was easy to jump off from the back of the bus, so we hopped on and off for several hours. Happenstance in miniature. 9:30 p.m. found us at the Austerlitz station, and the train left on time at 9:30. It was very crowded, with lots of Spaniards on their way home. An Australian girl came into our compartment. She had visited Morocco recently, but didn't provide much useful information. She was pretty tough, but travelling in smart clothes. We managed to sleep a bit and arrived in Hendaye at 6 a.m. Hendaye was a resort on the Atlantic coast. Spain was a short walk across the international bridge to the border town of Irun. The formalities were perfunctory, and we soon made our way to the station. Madrid was the next natural stop, but the trains turned out to be expensive, so we decided to hitchhike. This was a good decision. About the fifth car we thumbed, stopped, and was going all the way to Madrid. We passed some severely polluted rivers. They looked similar to this photo of the Rio Tinto, which flows in the west of Spain, but were blue and green in colour. We reached Madrid at 5 p.m. It was very busy and very hot. Most restaurants were closed because people ate in the evening. However, eventually found one open. It provided a good meal of veal or pork, we're not sure which, with chips and wine for 60 pesetas each. The first food we'd eaten since Paris. We walked out to the Toledo Road, found a suitable spot and tried to hitch a lift. It was hopeless. Small cars filled with families. There was a park nearby, so we decided to spend the night there. We'd slept in parks before, so as dusk approached we were not surprised to see the arrival of the rats. I rather admired their ability to thrive on the detritus of us humans. Summer would be their good time. Discarded half-eaten sandwiches, unfinished pastries, etc. But in winter there would not be too many visitors. Perhaps the parks were just the rats' summer holiday abode, and in the winter they would return to the inner city. In the morning the traffic was just as bad, so we decided to cut our losses and walk back into Madrid to take a train for a bit. There was a train going to Cordoba, 245 pesetas each. It arrived at 4:30 p.m. and we found ourselves a cheap hotel. 165 pesetas, about £1. There was hot water, so we had showers and washed our clothes. It was still light, so we had a good look at the mosque. This is an aerial view, and this is a view from the street. And then we walked to the river to see the famous bridge. Some men beckoned us down to an old water wheel. It was all very picturesque. After a meal of gazpacho, paella and wine, we returned to the hotel and had showers again, just for the luxury of it. In the morning, Tuesday the 9th of July, more showers, and then we took a third-class train to Agadir. It left late and was very slow, with lots of stops. However, it was a pleasant journey and not crowded. It arrived at 5 p.m. and we allowed ourselves to be conducted to a reasonable hotel for not too much money. Wednesday we had a look around the city. The main attraction was the cathedral. Eager to get to Morocco, the following day we took a bus to Algeciras and then a ferry to Ceuta. Ceuta was a strange place, an enclave of Spain on the African mainland. Morocco has had a very complicated history, but for much of the 20th century it was held under Spanish and French protectorate zones, which defended their economic interests. In 1956 most of these were relinquished, but Spain hung on to the Spanish Sahara, an area south of Agadir, until 1976, and it still holds the small zones around Ceuta and Melilla on the North African coast. During World War II, the Spanish zone under Franco was neutral, and the French zone was held by Vichy, but with a strong German presence, until the Allied invasion in 1942, at which time it switched its allegiance to Free France. The controversial destruction of the French fleet in Mers el-Kabir, Algeria, is common knowledge, but there was a much less known naval battle between the Americans and Vichy and German ships in 1942 Casablanca. Tangier was a special case. It was held as an international zone from 1925 until 1956, with a World War II interruption between 1940 and 1945, when it was held by the Spanish. The present constitutional monarchy was set up in 1962, although there was a monarchy of sorts since 1956. Morocco is an extremely Islamic country, and unlike much of the Middle East, it was not possible for us as infidels to enter the mosques. The only exception to this was Casablanca, where it was possible to enter some parts of the main mosque. The border facilities were speedy, but we were disappointed not to get interesting visas on our passports. The Moroccans provided us with maps and leaflets, so we sat down to study them. Fez looked very interesting, so we decided to make that our first destination. There was a bus just about to leave and not too expensive, so we took that rather than try hitchhiking. The Fez terminus was just outside the old city walls. We found a reasonable hotel close to the centre of the old city. The novel sanitary facilities consisted of a squatty lavatory with a shower head fixed above it. At least it kept the squatty clean. Fez was the most ancient of the four imperial cities of Morocco: Fez, Meknes, Marrakesh and Rabat, cities that had once been the capital. When the French took over their zone of Morocco, they saved the architecture of Fez by declaring the medieval city a historical monument. Then they built a modern Fez alongside, the Fez Nouvelle. However, they also transferred the economic and political functions to Rabat. After independence in 1956, the city lost most of its Jewish community to France and Israel. What followed was a gradual decline and an influx of poor migrants. At the time of our visit, it depended greatly on the production of handicrafts and tourism. However, as a spectacle, there is little to surpass it. There are many videos of Fez on YouTube showing in detail its touristical attractions. Since this is primarily a video of a journey, I will restrict myself to some of the parts that we photographed. This is the bus terminus where we arrived. This is the Maidan. This shows the outside of the walls, and this one the river, and finally one of the gateways. When the time to leave arrived, we took a bus to Meknes. In a similar way to Fez, Meknes has an old town and a new town, but here they are situated on opposite banks of a river, the Oued Boufekan. The old town was established on the west bank during the reign of Sultan Moulay Ismail, 1672 to 1727. This shows one of its best attractions. It's smaller than Fez, and we were able to walk around most of it in a day, so we decided to press on and took a bus to Marrakesh. We arrived in Marrakesh in the early evening. The central square of the old town, the Gemma El Fna, was at its best. It was thronged with people watching acrobats, storytellers, snake charmers, etc., and all the time there was insistent music and drumming. The air was full of scents and smoke, which added to the sense of strangeness and mystery. We found a hotel less than 100 yards away, and although not the Hilton, it was quite acceptable. In the morning the music was gone, and the square took on more the appearance of a market. There were still some performers around, but the mystery was missing. Marrakesh was established over 1,000 years ago, but since then it has suffered numerous destructions and rebuildings. However, apart from the great Kutuba Mosque and minaret, there are few architectural attractions. Its charm depends on the life of the central square and areas such as that used for leather dyeing, the extensive souks, and the groves of palm trees outside the walls. At this point our camera stopped working. We couldn't get it repaired in Marrakesh, and we couldn't buy another 35mm camera. In the end we bought a Kodak Instamatic. This took square pictures and used a different film size. However, we were able to swap our films for Instamatic films. When I digitized the results, I edited most of the shots to rectangular form. After leaving Marrakesh, we decided to continue south to visit Taradant and Agadir. This meant crossing the Atlas Mountains. It was not a journey to be taken lightly. The Tizi Test Pass was 2,092 metres, but it wasn't the height that was the problem. The road surface was very bad, and there was a series of hairpin bends with horrific drops. This map shows some of the hairpins, and this photo gives a general impression. It wouldn't have been so bad in a car, but on the hairpins the length of our bus made it hazardous in the extreme. Even the bus crew realised this, and in the worst places we were ordered off while the bus was worked around in a series of backwards and forwards manoeuvres. Rocks were placed beneath the rear wheels each time the vehicle neared the edge. I was unconvinced that they would stop a disaster if the driver judged it wrong or his foot slipped. Why ever didn't they carry something better? Inshallah was the answer. Either your number was up or it wasn't. In later years the hairpins were widened, but since then a better road has bypassed the problem. For anyone wishing to experience the original route, earthquakes and a lack of maintenance have restored its dangers. Eventually, unscathed, we wound down to the plain. It was oppressively hot, and the bus made several stops for refreshment. In one place a stork walked in through the door. It crossed the floor, and ignored by the clientele, eventually left by another exit. Finally we reached Taradant, the famed Pearl of the South. It still retained its extensive defensive walls, but a gateway opened out onto a large maidan. The heat was intense and reflected off the ground and the buildings, but it was not so bad in the souk. However, as soon as we could find another bus, we set out for Agadir. On arrival, we discovered that the earthquake of 1960 had virtually destroyed Agadir. Despite its modest magnitude of 5.8, the earthquake's narrow depth resulted in intense shaking. Between 12,000 and 15,000 people were killed, and another 12,000 were injured. The high numbers were in part due to the poor construction of the buildings. There wasn't much left to see, except for the fishing boats. So the same evening we took a bus to Essaouira, further up the coast. This is the end of part 1. Part 2 starts by describing our journey up the Atlantic coast to Tangier. We then visited Gibraltar before hitching along the Mediterranean coast until, by happenstance, we came across a narrow-gauge railway.